The Cold War, a conflict never officially declared, yet one that divided the world into two opposing blocs: the West, led by the United States, and the East, dominated by the Soviet Union and China. One of the bloodiest battlegrounds of this global struggle was Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia that became the ultimate symbol of ideological confrontation, but also of suffering and resistance. After World War II, Vietnam was still a French colony, but the national movement, led by Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communist cause, and a man devoted to the idea of liberation through socialism, began its struggle for independence. After a brutal war against France, in 1954 the Geneva Conference decided that the country would be divided into two states: the Communist North, under Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by the United States. The division line was drawn at the 17th parallel. The United States saw this division as part of a much larger battle, the fight against the spread of communism. In Washington, the so-called domino theory prevailed. If one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would inevitably follow. Vietnam was, therefore, much more than a local conflict. It was a test of strength between two world orders. At first, America provided military and financial aid to South Vietnam. Advisors, weapons, and funds were sent. But as the conflict escalated, so did American involvement. The turning point came in the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, when U.S. ships were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. President Lyndon B. Johnson used the event to secure the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress, granting him almost unlimited power to escalate the war. This marked the beginning of direct American warfare in Vietnam. Soon, tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers were deployed. At the peak of the war, in 1968, more than 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam. But what Washington envisioned as a quick and decisive intervention turned into a nightmare. The guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, the communist insurgents in the South, proved brutally effective. Instead of traditional front lines, the war was fought in jungles, villages, and cities. Any farmer could be a soldier, any road a trap, any village a minefield. The most famous blow came with the Tet Offensive in January 1968. While Americans and South Vietnamese forces celebrated the New Year holiday, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops launched massive surprise attacks across the country, even reaching Saigon itself. Although militarily repelled with heavy losses for the North, the psychological impact in the United States was devastating. On television, Americans saw dead soldiers, burning villages, and the destruction of war. Trust in the government collapsed, and anti-war protests erupted across the nation. America unleashed enormous military power in Vietnam. Napalm bombs and Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant, left permanent scars on both the land and the people. Yet despite all the technological superiority, morale and determination were stronger on the other side. For the North Vietnamese soldiers and the Viet Cong guerrillas, this was not just another war. It was a fight for survival, for freedom from foreign domination, and for national unification. For the North Vietnamese soldiers and the Viet Cong guerrillas, this was not just another war. It was a war of liberation, a war for the unification of their country and freedom from foreign domination. Despite enormous losses, their will to resist remained unbreakable. As the years passed, the war increasingly became a political crisis within the United States itself. While thousands of young Americans lost their lives in the jungles of Vietnam, at home students, artists, and ordinary citizens marched in protest. The slogan, "Bring our boys home," echoed through the streets. The Vietnam War became a symbol of the futility and cynicism of the Cold War. The turning point came in the early 1970s. Under growing public pressure and facing the reality that victory was unattainable, President Richard Nixon introduced the policy of Vietnamization, the gradual withdrawal of American troops and the transfer of the fighting burden to the South Vietnamese army. At the same time, secret negotiations with the North began in Paris. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and the United States withdrew its forces. But peace was an illusion. Fighting continued between North and South, and without U.S. support, South Vietnam could not survive. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive. On April 30, 1975, tanks of the People's Army of Vietnam crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. South Vietnam ceased to exist, and the country was reunified under communist rule. The images of helicopters evacuating the last Americans from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy became a global symbol of superpower humiliation. The consequences were catastrophic. More than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives, while millions of Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians, perished. The land was devastated, villages burned, jungles poisoned by chemical weapons. For America, Vietnam was a wound that scarred an entire generation. Distrust in government, the trauma of veterans, and the bitter sense of defeat reshaped how the U.S. approached future wars. For Vietnam, it was a victory, but a victory bought at the cost of unimaginable suffering. Thus, the Vietnam War became the bloodiest front of the Cold War. It was not only an ideological clash, but also a human tragedy, and it remains a stark warning to the world. When the battles of great powers spill into small nations, the deepest scars are always left on those who had the least say, ordinary people.